on the Mount.
I think he probably did say some of them, yes. And I think you have to go case by case to do an analysis, which is what people like Richard and I do. We go through each line to see, is this plausibly something that Jesus said? But I think that the problem is that many New Testament scholars have such kind of narrow vision. And so they ask, is Matthew 6:33 something Jesus said? Well, that's fine. You do need to ask that. But what about Thomas 1:14? It's clear Christians are making up stories about Jesus, and they're making up sayings of Jesus. Nobody doubts that. I mean, Richard certainly doesn't doubt that. Gospel of Thomas 1:14 has a very pithy saying of Jesus. Every woman who makes herself a male shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, is that something that Jesus really said? Probably not. It's a pithy saying. It's in an early source. Did somebody memorize Jesus saying that? Well, no, probably not. Probably somebody made up that saying. And so the question's not whether Christians were making up sayings of Jesus or making up sermons of Jesus. They certainly were making up both sayings and sermons. The question is, how do you know in a particular case that this is something Jesus really said or not?
Richard?
Well, I actually think, the attempt to take an individual saying like that, which is what scholars have been trying to do, since form criticism, because form criticism gave us the situation where all we can do is assess each saying individually because, they're sort of independent traditions. And I don't think you can do it. I agree with Bart about that saying in Thomas, but why do we think that? Because it appears to be Jesus saying something very different from anything in earlier records of Jesus' sayings, I suppose. I mean, there are other sayings in Thomas which are not in our Gospels, which are quite sort of coherent with what we have in our Gospels, and maybe Jesus did say them. But how on earth do we tell? It's extremely difficult to assess a single saying. Can
I just respond to that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just I got 2 points about it. One is that Richard, I thought you were bringing up the point of individual sayings because I said that Jesus couldn't have delivered the Sermon on the Mount the way it's given, and you said that it's the individual sayings that he said.
Yes.
And so my question is, which are the individual sayings that he said? And now you're saying you can't decide that. So if he didn't deliver the Sermon on the Mount and you can't decide on the individual sayings, I don't really know what you're left with.
No. What I think is that what we can do as historians is make general judgments about the reliability of a source. And we may decide that Matthew's a pretty good source of remembering the teaching of Jesus. And we just have to go with that. We can't say, well, most of the time he's okay, but this particular one really doesn't look authentic. I mean, I don't think
that's really kind of the point, is that in your book what you argue is that the eyewitness were guarantors of the tradition.
Yes.
And so it sounds like what you want to argue is that they guarantee that the tradition is accurate. But now you're saying that the Sermon on the Mount is not something that Jesus delivered and that we can't decide on individual sayings. And so I don't see in what sense these eyewitness reports are guarantors of the tradition.
Well, I never meant to say that they guaranteed that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. It never occurred to me that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, actually. I think it's very obviously a device of the writer of the Gospel to collect Jesus' teaching and to make a useful collection of stuff. Just as, Mark has a whole series of Jesus' miracles. They didn't necessarily happen, one after the other on that day. He's just collected them in order to present them to his readers. So the way in which the material is selected and compiled in that sort of way is not something the eyewitnesses have very much to do with.
I would completely agree with that, but I do want to point out that the form critics that you've been disparaging are the ones who came up with this idea that the gospel writers were collecting stories that were in independent circulation.
I'm not necessarily.
I don't agree with the form critics on lots and lots of things, and I don't sort of tie my horse to that wagon. But that was something they said that I think is probably right, that the gospel writers have heard a bunch of stories of Jesus and they're collecting them together in their gospels, and they're providing the frameworks for these things themselves.
Yes, I mean, to a lot. I don't think that's entirely true, but I go quite a long way with that. But
I think that's what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, I think there are traces, for example, in Mark's Gospel of a sort of an outline of Jesus' ministry, which may have been a traditional kind of outline, and Mark is using that outline. But I mean, I don't imagine Peter could have remembered in which order these particular healing miracles of Jesus happened. That wasn't something that the eyewitnesses would have remembered, or it wasn't of any importance. They did.
No, I agree. They wouldn't have remembered that, which means that somebody else has put these stories together.
Yeah.
That they're not the way that they really happened.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, I don't think readers of ancient biographies. I mean, take for example Lucian's biography of Demonax. A lot of it consists of short little stories, like the pronouncement stories in the Gospel. You know, Demonax was approached by somebody and asked by them, and this is what he said. I don't think anybody reading Lucian's Life of Demonax would imagine he's put these in the right chronological order. He's just collected them. And that's
That's exactly right. So the idea that the eyewitnesses have guaranteed the accuracy of these traditions is not right. It's more like Lucian's Demonax or his Alexander of Abignonticus. I mean, these are biographies that are not historically accurate in any modern sense of the term.
Well, it had never occurred to me that it matters whether Mark has got these healing miracles in the right